When Cleopatra was born, the Great Pyramid was already more than 2,000 years old. It had stood so long by then that its builders were forgotten, and the stories told about it were already wrong. She lived closer in time to the first moon landing than to the men who raised it. That is the first thing to understand about Egypt. It did not simply last a long time. It lasted so long that its own people spent most of their history walking past the ruins of themselves. And all of it, every temple and every pharaoh and every golden mask, grew out of one thing. A river running through a desert where almost nothing should live, that arrived on time. Egypt begins, as everything in Egypt begins, with the flood. Every year, in the deep of summer, the Nile would rise. Not violently, and not by accident, but on a schedule so reliable that a whole civilization set its calendar by it. The water would swell and spill over its banks, and spread out across the flat land on either side, and sit there for weeks. And when it drew back again, it left behind a thin layer of dark silt, carried down from mountains 1,000 miles to the south. Rich, black, and new. Every single year. The Egyptians called their country Kemet, which means the Black Land. Not for the people, and not for the night, but for that soil. The dark ribbon along the river where things would grow. And beyond it, where the silt never reached, they called the Red Land. The desert. The place where you did not go. So the shape of Egypt is simple and strange. A country 1,000 miles long, and in most places only a few miles wide. A green thread laid across an ocean of sand. That thread was extraordinarily generous. The flood did the work that farmers elsewhere broke their backs for. It watered, and it fertilized, and it did so on time. A family could feed itself and still have grain left over. And grain left over is the beginning of everything else. Of priests, and scribes, and stonemasons, and kings. But the flood had to be measured, and predicted, and shared out. And that took organization on a scale no one had tried before. Watchers upstream to send word that the water was coming. Officials to record how high it rose. Channels and basins to hold it. Registers of who owed what, in a year when the river was kind, and in a year when it was not. To do all that, they needed to write things down. And so, very early, Egypt invented one of the world's first writing systems. Little pictures, carved and painted, that we call hieroglyphs. The Egyptians called them the words of the gods. And here is the quiet marvel at the bottom of all of it. Almost everything you are about to hear tonight, the pyramids, the gods, the golden masks, the empire, grew out of a river arriving on time, and people careful enough to write down when it did. So let us stop, before the kings, and look at the people. Because for almost everyone who ever lived in Egypt, the pharaoh was a distant rumor and the temple was closed to them, and life was a house of mud brick beside a field. The house would have been small, and cool, and mostly dark, with narrow windows high in the wall to keep out the sun. The roof was flat, made of palm trunks and matting, and in the hot months the family slept up there, under the stars, where the air moved. There was a small courtyard with an oven. There were storage jars sunk into the floor. There were reed mats, low stools, headrests of wood for sleeping, and very little else. They ate bread and they drank beer, and both of those were the same thing, more or less. Emmer wheat and barley, ground on a stone quern, which is patient, brutal work, and which wore the front teeth of Egyptians down to stumps because the grit from the grindstone went into the loaf. The beer was thick and only lightly alcoholic, closer to a soup than a drink, and it was safe and nourishing, and it was what workmen were paid in. Beyond the bread there were onions and garlic and leeks, cucumbers, lettuce, beans and lentils, figs and dates and pomegranates. Fish from the river, dried and salted. Ducks and geese from the marshes. Meat from cattle was for the rich and for festivals. Honey was the only sweetness there was. And the year was not divided into 4 seasons but 3, and every one of them was the rivers. Akhet, the flood, when the fields were underwater and no farming was possible. Peret, the coming forth, when the water withdrew and everything was planted at once. Shimu, the harvest, the anxious hot weeks of cutting and threshing and counting. That first season, the flood, is why the pyramids exist. For 3 months of every year, a very large number of strong people had nothing agricultural to do. A state that could feed them could also move them, and set them to work. Now, the part that surprises people. Egyptian women had rights that would not be matched again in the Western world for something like 3,000 years. A woman could own property in her own name, and buy and sell it, and lend money at interest. She could bring a case in court and testify without a male sponsor. She kept her own property in a marriage and took it with her out of a divorce, and she could initiate the divorce herself. Some marriage contracts specify what the husband owes her if he leaves. Marriage itself was not a religious ceremony at all. It seems to have been, essentially, moving in together with a contract about property. Love poetry survives, and it is startlingly direct and modern, full of sighing over a beloved's approach and inventing excuses to walk past their house. They kept pets, seriously and affectionately. Dogs with names carved on their collars, and cats, which were genuinely beloved and not merely useful, and monkeys, and geese. Herodotus, visiting later, claimed that when a household cat died the family shaved their eyebrows in mourning. He exaggerated a great deal, but not about how much they liked the cat. Children played with balls of linen, wooden animals with jaws that moved on a string, and spinning tops. There are board games, and we have the boards. One, called Senet, was so tightly bound up with the journey of the soul that a set was buried with Tutankhamun in case he wanted a game on the way. So hold that picture for a moment, because it is the true picture. Not slaves under a whip. A crowded, gossiping, litigious, beer-drinking country of families on a strip of black soil, who kept cats, and wrote love poems, and went to court over a boundary stone. And every one of them lived by the same river, and watched the same water, and waited for the same flood. Let that green thread unroll beneath us in the dark. And let us go back to the very beginning of the kings. Before there were pharaohs, there were 2 Egypts. In the south lay Upper Egypt, the long narrow valley, closer to the river's source. In the north lay Lower Egypt, where the Nile finally opens its hand and spreads into the wide green fan of the delta. 2 lands, 2 crowns, 2 sets of local rulers, sometimes trading and sometimes at war. Then, a little after 3,000 years before our era, someone joined them. We know his name, or we think we do. He is called Nama, and on a beautiful carved slate palette, worn smooth by 5,000 years, we can still see him. On one side he wears the tall white crown of the south, striking down an enemy. On the other he wears the red crown of the north, walking in procession past the fallen. One king, both crowns, one country. Whether it truly happened in one reign, or slowly over generations, we cannot be certain. But from that moment the idea never really let go. Egypt was the two lands, held together by a single figure, and that figure was not quite a man. Because this is the strange and central thing about a pharaoh. He was not simply a ruler. He was the living link between the world of people and the world of the gods. His task was to hold up Ma'at, which meant truth, and balance, and the correct order of things, against the chaos always pressing in at the edges. If the pharaoh did his part, the river would rise, the grain would grow, and the sun would come back in the morning. That is an enormous thing to put on one person's shoulders. And it explains almost everything that follows. Why a king would spend his whole reign, and the labor of a nation, building himself a tomb. It was not vanity, or not only vanity. His death, and what came after it, was a matter of national survival. The centuries that follow the unification are what we call the Old Kingdom. And it is in the Old Kingdom, with astonishing speed, that Egypt does the thing everyone remembers. Let the two crowns settle into one. Ahead of us, on the western bank, the ground begins to rise. For most of human history, nobody had ever built anything in stone that mattered. Houses were mud brick. Palaces were mud brick. Even the tombs of the first kings were low rectangular platforms of brick and rubble, called mastabas, which is simply the Arabic word for bench. And then a man named Imhotep had an idea. He served King Dosa, and he was that rarest kind of person, an architect whose name outlived his building's owner. His idea was to take the flat mastaba and set a slightly smaller one on top of it. And then another. And then another, 6 in all, rising in steps toward the sky. It was the first large stone building on Earth. It is still standing, at Saqqara, more than 4,500 years later. And you can feel, looking at it, that someone was working out the rules as they went. Because within a few generations, they had solved it. The steps were filled in. The angles were fixed. And on the plateau at Giza, a king we call Khufu raised the thing that has never quite been surpassed. The Great Pyramid was, for nearly 4,000 years, the tallest building in the world. It is made of something like 2 million blocks of stone. Its base is level to within a couple of centimeters across an area larger than several city blocks. Its sides are aligned to true north with an accuracy that would satisfy a modern surveyor. And it was built without iron tools, without pulleys as we know them, and without the wheel playing any serious part. So how? Here we should be careful, because this is where a great deal of nonsense has grown up. What we actually have is better than the nonsense, and stranger. We have the workers' town, excavated in the sand beside the plateau. We have their bakeries, and the bones of the cattle they were fed, in quantities that tell us these were not starving slaves but valued laborers, eating well. We have their cemetery, where men who died on the job were buried with honor in the shadow of the thing they built. And we have papyrus, In a cave on the Red Sea coast, archaeologists found the logbook of a man named Mir, an overseer who ferried limestone blocks down the river to Giza. He wrote down his working days. He is the only voice we have from inside the greatest construction project of the ancient world, and what he mostly talks about is logistics. The pyramid was not raised by mystery. It was raised by an entire country in the season when the fields were underwater and there was nothing else to do, organized by men with lists. Exactly how the blocks went up the slope is still argued about. Long straight ramps, spiraling ramps, ramps inside the structure itself. We genuinely do not know, and honest people disagree. But the wonder does not need the mystery. Look at it plainly. A people who had only just learned to build in stone at all decided to make a mountain by hand so that one man could safely become a god. And they got it right to within a few centimeters. And lying below the pyramids, facing the sunrise, is the thing that has never given up its secret. The Great Sphinx is carved from a single outcrop of limestone, left standing in a quarry while the stone around it was cut away for the pyramids. It is about 20 meters high and 70 long. A lion's body, and a human head wearing the royal headcloth. We do not know, with certainty, who built it, or when, or who the face is meant to be. The usual answer is Khafra, the son of Khufu, whose pyramid stands directly behind it and whose causeway runs past its shoulder. That is a strong argument. There is also a serious minority who think it is older, or that the head was recut from something larger, because the head is noticeably small in proportion to the body, as though a damaged original had been trimmed down. There is no inscription from its own time saying what it is. Not one. The largest sculpture anyone had ever made, and nobody wrote down whose face it wore. By the time of the New Kingdom, 1,000 years later, it had been swallowed to the neck by sand, and the Egyptians themselves had forgotten. They decided it was a god called Hormakhit, Horus of the horizon, and worshipped it as such, which tells you how long ago its own builders had gone. And then there is the loveliest small story on the whole plateau. A young prince, out hunting in the desert, lies down to rest in the Sphinx's shadow at midday and falls asleep. In his dream the Sphinx speaks to him, and says that the sand is choking it, and that if the prince will clear it away, he will be made king of Egypt. He did. And he was. And when he became Thutmose IV, he set a slab of granite between the Sphinx's paws with that dream written on it, and it is still there, and you can read it. It is almost certainly propaganda by a man who was not the obvious heir and needed a divine reason to be on the throne. It is also a beautiful thing to do. He wrote down his dream and put it in stone at the feet of the monument, and 3,400 years later, we are still reading it. As for the nose, it was not shot off by Napoleon's soldiers, whatever the guides tell you. There are drawings of the Sphinx without a nose from long before Napoleon was born. The most likely account comes from a 15th century Arab historian, who records that a Sufi named Muhammad Saim al-Dar was so offended by peasants making offerings to the statue for a good harvest that he defaced it, and was, according to that same source, killed by a mob for doing it. Which means the damage is not the work of an invading army. It is the work of one furious man who could not stand that people were still, after 4,000 years, quietly asking a lion for rain. Let that great shape fall behind us into the dark now, still holding the day's heat. There is more to this than stone. To understand why they built it, we have to meet the gods. The Egyptian gods can seem, at first, like a crowd. There are hundreds of them. They change over 3,000 years. They merge into one another, split apart, and take on each other's names. A god worshipped in one town is the same god under a different name in the next. Trying to hold them all is like trying to hold the river. So let us not try. Let us take only the few you need for the rest of the night. First, the sun. Ra, who sails across the sky in a boat by day, and who sails at night through the underworld, through darkness and danger, to be born again at dawn. Every sunrise is a victory that had to be won again in the dark. There is nothing casual about mourning in Egypt. Then the family at the center of everything. Osiris, a good king who taught people to farm. His brother Set, who was jealous, and who murdered him, and scattered the pieces of his body across the land. And Isis, Osiris's wife, who went out and gathered up every piece, and put her husband back together, and by magic and by sheer refusal to accept the loss, brought him back. But not back to this world. Osiris rose as the ruler of the dead. And their son, Horus, grew up to challenge Set and take back his father's throne, and every living pharaoh was understood to be Horus, and every dead pharaoh to be Osiris. Hear what that story is doing. It takes the worst thing there is, that people we love die and are broken and do not come back, and it says, quietly, that once, someone was put back together. That death can be a doorway rather than a wall. And holding all of it upright is that idea we met before. Ma'at. Order, truth, balance, the way things are supposed to be. Not a commandment handed down, but a state of the world that everyone, from the pharaoh to the farmer, was responsible for keeping in place. Chaos was always there, at the edge of the fields, in the desert, in the dark. Ma'at was the daily work of holding it back. That is the shape of the Egyptian mind. A universe that is good, and ordered, and beautiful, and that will stay that way only if we all keep doing our part. Let those old gods move quietly at the edge of your thoughts now. Because their story leads directly to the thing Egypt is most famous for. What happens to us afterwards? No people has ever prepared for death as thoroughly as the Egyptians. And it is easy to misunderstand why. They were not gloomy. They did not long to die. Quite the opposite. They loved this world so much, the river and the food and the family and the warm evenings, that what they wanted, more than anything, was to keep it. The Egyptian afterlife is not an escape from life. It is life, continued, in a better country that looks remarkably like this one. But to get there, something of you had to survive. And they thought carefully about what that something was. They believed a person was made of several parts. The body. The name, which had to be spoken and written to endure. The Ka, a kind of life force that stayed with the body and needed feeding. And the Ba, the part that could move, often drawn as a bird with a human face, flying out of the tomb and back again. If the body rotted away, the Ka had nowhere to return to. So the body had to be kept. It took 70 days. The internal organs were removed and stored separately, all but the heart, which was left in place because the heart was where a person did their thinking and feeling. The body was packed in natron, a natural salt from the desert lakes, and left to dry completely. Then it was washed, oiled, wrapped in many layers of linen with small protective charms laid between them, and given a mask so that the soul would know its own face. And then the journey. The dead went down into a dark country, and had to pass tests, and speak the right words, and know the names of the doors. That is what the Book of the Dead really is. Not scripture, but a traveler's handbook, buried with you, so you would not be lost. At the end of it came the weighing. In a great hall, before Osiris, your heart was set on one side of a balance. On the other side was placed a single feather, the feather of Ma'at, of truth. And you spoke, one by one, the things you had not done. I have not stolen. I have not lied. I have not caused pain. I have not held back the water when my neighbor's field was dry. If the heart balanced against the feather, you passed into the good country. If it was heavy with the weight of a bad life, a waiting creature ate it, and you simply ended. 3,000 years before anything you would recognize as modern morality, in a hot country beside a river, people were saying that what finally matters about a life is whether it was heavy or light. Whether you took more than you gave. Let that quiet hall fade now. The scales are balanced. There is nothing you need to answer for tonight. And behind all of that stood a small class of people who could do the one thing that made Egypt possible. They could write. To be a scribe was to be exempt. There is a famous, and very funny, school text in which a teacher lists every other trade in the country to frighten a boy into studying. The metalworker with fingers like crocodile skin. The barber trudging from street to street. The reed cutter eaten by mosquitoes. The wizherman working beside the crocodiles. And after each one, the same refrain. But the scribe, he is the one who directs. Be a scribe. Boys, and it was almost always boys, went to school and copied. They copied classic texts over and over onto flakes of limestone, because papyrus was expensive, and thousands of these practice pieces survive with the teacher's corrections still on them. It is oddly moving to hold, in a museum case, the homework of a bored 12-year-old from 3,300 years ago, done badly. Papyrus itself was made from the reed that grew in the marshes. The pith was cut into strips, laid in 2 layers at right angles, pressed and beaten until the plant's own sap glued it into a sheet, then polished smooth with a stone. It is astonishingly durable. In a dry climate it lasts millennia, which is precisely why we know so much. And what they wrote down included medicine. This is one of the places where Egypt is at its most surprising. There is a document we call the Edwin Smith Papyrus, and it is a surgical manual. It describes 48 cases, from the head downward, each one laid out the same way. The title of the case: The Examination, with what to look for. The diagnosis. And then the verdict, in one of 3 phrases. An ailment I will treat. An ailment I will fight with. Or, unsparingly, an ailment for which nothing can be done. There is no magic in it. There is careful observation. It notices that damage to one side of the head produces weakness on the other side of the body. It describes the pulse and the surface of the brain, and uses the word brain, which no earlier text anywhere does. It prescribes stitches and honey, which is genuinely antibacterial, and raw meat on the first day for a wound, and setting broken bones with splints. Other papyri are far less rigorous, and full of spells and dubious remedies for things nobody could actually treat. Which is exactly what you would expect. When you can do something, you do it. When you cannot, you pray. The Egyptians did both, sometimes in the same paragraph, and they saw no contradiction. They had dentists, and we have skulls with drilled abscesses and a bridge of gold wire holding teeth together. They had specialists. Herodotus, again, says each physician treated one disease and no more, which is likely too neat, but the impulse is there. And around all of it were amulets, in enormous numbers. The scarab beetle, which rolls a ball of dung and was therefore the image of the sun being rolled across the sky and life renewing itself. The eye of Horus, damaged and healed, worn against harm. The ankh, the sign of life itself, held in the hand of every god in every painting. Small blue faience charms, the cheapest possible objects, sold to ordinary people at temple gates, found in their thousands. That is a whole civilization in one habit. Do what medicine you can. Then put something small and blue around the child's neck, because you love them, and because the world is dangerous, and because it might help. There is one more thing they worked out early, lying on those flat roofs at night, and we are still using it. The problem was the flood. It was reliable, but only roughly, and a country that plants everything in the same 3 weeks needs to know when. And somebody noticed a star. For part of the year the brightest star in the sky, the one we call Sirius, is invisible. It is lost in the glare of the sun. And then, on one particular morning, it rises just before dawn and is visible for a few minutes in the east before the daylight takes it. The Egyptians called that star Sopdate, and they called that morning its heliacal rising. And it happened, almost exactly, at the moment the flood began. So they built their year on it. And in doing so they made something no one else had. A calendar of 365 days, divided into 12 months of 30, plus 5 extra days at the end that belonged to no month and were considered the birthdays of the gods, and were slightly unlucky. 12 months, 30 days, 3 seasons. It is the direct ancestor of the calendar on your wall. They knew it was not perfect. A year is a little longer than 365 days, and so their calendar drifted slowly against the real seasons, by 1 day every 4 years, going all the way round and coming back to the start after about 1460 years. They knew. There is a text complaining that winter has come in summer and the months are upside down. They simply preferred a calendar that was regular and easy to count over one that was accurate. At night they divided the darkness by the stars. They picked 36 groups of stars, which we call decans, spaced around the sky so that a new one rose roughly every 40 minutes. A priest watching through the night could tell the hour by which decan was on the horizon. 12 of them were visible across a full night, and so the night had 12 hours, and by symmetry so did the day. Which is why there are 24 hours in your day. Not because of anything to do with the sun's arithmetic. Because Egyptian priests picked 36 star groups, and 12 of them fit into a night. Their hours were not equal, of course. A summer night is short and a winter night is long, and dividing each into 12 gives you hours that stretch and shrink with the season. Fixed hours came much later, with mechanical clocks. But the 12 is theirs. They had water clocks, stone bowls with a small hole in the bottom and hour marks scratched inside, so you could measure the night even under cloud. And they had shadow clocks for the day. So a farmer in the Nile Valley, 4,000 years ago, lived inside a system of time we would recognize. A 365-day year. 12 months. 24 hours. They got all of that from watching one star come back, every summer, just before the water rose. To understand what all that gold was actually for, you have to understand that an Egyptian temple was not a church. Ordinary people did not go inside. There was no congregation, no service, no sermon. A temple was a house, and a god lived in it, and it was run like a household, by staff. Deep inside, past courts and halls that grew progressively darker and lower and narrower, there was a small dark room, and in it a shrine, and inside the shrine a statue. Not a symbol of a god. The god, in the sense that the divine presence had settled into the image. And every single morning, a priest broke the clay seal on the shrine, opened the doors, and woke it. The statue was washed, and anointed with oil, and dressed in fresh linen, and given jewelry, and set before a meal. Music was played. Incense was burned. At the end of the day the god was undressed, the food removed, the doors closed, the seal replaced. Every day. In every temple. For 3,000 years. That was the deal. The state fed and clothed the gods, and the gods kept the sun rising and the river coming. It was not devotion in our sense. It was maintenance of the universe, carried out by professionals on a rota. Which is why the great festivals mattered so much, because they were the only time anyone else or anything. At the Opit festival at Thebes, the statue of Amun was taken out of Karnak, hidden inside a covered shrine on a golden bark, and carried on the shoulders of priests down the avenue of Sphinxes to Luxor Temple, with crowds lining the route, and music, and enormous quantities of free bread and beer distributed by the state. You still did not see the god. You saw the box the god was in, and that was the closest anyone got, and it was the event of the year. And then there are the animals. The Egyptians did not worship animals, exactly, but they saw the divine expressed through them, and it went very deep. The Apis bull was a single living bull, chosen for specific markings, who was understood to be a manifestation of a god. He lived in a temple compound, was cared for, and when he died he was mummified and buried in a vast underground gallery in a granite sarcophagus weighing many tons, and then the priests went out and searched Egypt for the calf who was the next one. There are catacombs beneath the sand at Saqqara containing the mummies of millions of ibises. Millions. There are galleries of falcons, of baboons, of crocodiles. And there are cats, in staggering numbers, bred at temple farms specifically to be mummified and sold to pilgrims as offerings. In the 1800s, a shipment of something like 19 tons of mummified Egyptian cats was sent to England and ground up for fertilizer. A single skull was kept and given to a museum. It is easy to hear that and feel only the loss. But hold the other half of it too. that there was a country where, for thousands of years, the ordinary way to ask a god for help was to bring a small wrapped animal to a temple gate and hand it over and hope. The Old Kingdom did not last. After many centuries, the central power weakened. The pyramids got smaller, then stopped. The provinces went their own way. And there are texts from this period, unsettling and modern, in which writers say that the world has turned upside down, that the poor now wear the linen of the rich, that no one can be sure of anything. Some of it was politics. But underneath, there was probably something simpler and harder. The river failed. Several years of low flood, one after another, and a system built entirely on a reliable river has nothing left to stand on. For about a century Egypt was divided. Then a family from the south, from a then unremarkable town called Thebes, fought their way north and put it back together. What follows is the Middle Kingdom, and it has a different flavor from what came before. The kings still built, but more modestly, and in mud brick with stone facing, which is why so little of it survives. They pushed south into Nubia and built great fortresses along the river. They drained and farmed a marshy depression called the Fayum, one of the largest engineering projects of the ancient world, and hardly anyone has heard of it. But the thing the Middle Kingdom is really remembered for is words. This is when Egyptian literature comes into its own, and later Egyptians look back on it the way we look back on the classics. There are stories of shipwrecked sailors and talking serpents. There are bitter, funny complaints about being a scribe. There is a long poem about a man named Sinew who flees Egypt in a panic, makes a good life abroad, grows old among strangers, and then writes to the king begging to be allowed to come home and be buried in his own soil. That is a very human note to find for 1,000 years down. Not a god-king, not a monument. A man who did well in a foreign country and still could not bear the thought of dying there. The Middle Kingdom ended as the Old Kingdom had, in weakening and division. And this time something new came with it. From the northeast, people we call the Hyksos moved into the delta, and settled, and eventually ruled it. They brought the horse and chariot, and improved bronze, and a new kind of bow. For a while there were two Egypts again. A foreign dynasty in the north, and the old Egyptian line holding on at Thebes in the south. And when Thebes finally rose and drove them out, Egypt came out of that fight changed. Harder. Armed. And no longer willing to wait quietly behind its deserts. Let those hard years pass. What comes next is the Golden Age. The New Kingdom is Egypt at the height of its power, and it is the Egypt you have probably seen. The great temples at Karnak and Luxor. The painted tombs cut deep into the rock of a dry valley across the river from Thebes, the place we call the Valley of the Kings. Gold, and obelisks, and a court of extraordinary sophistication. For the first time Egypt is not only a country but an empire, its armies reaching north into Syria and south deep into Nubia, its treasuries filling with tribute. The pharaohs of this age stopped building pyramids. A pyramid is a signpost saying, "Here is a great deal of gold," and by now every one of them had been robbed. So they went the other way, and hid. Tunnels driven into the rock of a desert valley, sealed and disguised, with the funerary temple built somewhere else entirely. And near the beginning of all this, something remarkable happened on the throne. A king dies, leaving an heir too young to rule. The boy's stepmother steps in as regent, as royal women sometimes did. But she does not step back out again. Instead, over a few years, she is shown in the carvings differently, and then differently again, until she is wearing the full regalia of a pharaoh, with the ceremonial beard, and is called king. Her name is Hatshepsut, and she ruled Egypt for about 2 decades, and by every measure they were good years. She reopened the long trade route to a distant land called Punt, and had the whole expedition carved onto the walls of her temple, the ships, the strange trees brought back in baskets, the foreign houses on stilts. Her funerary temple, rising in wide terraces against a cliff of golden rock, is one of the most beautiful buildings anyone has ever put up. Long after her death, someone went through her monuments and chiseled her name and image out. For a long time this was told as a story of hatred, of a resentful stepson erasing her. The truth now looks quieter and sadder. The erasing began decades later, and seems to have been less about her as a person than about tidying the official list of kings into an unbroken line of men. She was almost removed from history. She was not. And the temple she built is still there, catching the light every morning, exactly as she intended. And the man who made it an empire has a name few people outside Egyptology know. Thutmose III came to the throne as a child, and spent the first 2 decades of his reign in the shadow of Hatshepsut. When she died, he had something like 30 years left, and he used them. In his first campaign he marched north into the Levant, where a coalition of city-states had gathered against him at a place called Megiddo. His generals wanted to take one of the 2 safe, wide roads around the ridge. He insisted on the narrow pass, straight through, where the army had to go in single file and could have been destroyed if anyone had been waiting. Nobody was. He came out on the plain in front of the city with his army intact and the enemy facing the wrong way. The battle was won almost at once, and then very nearly lost again, because his soldiers stopped to loot the abandoned camp instead of pursuing, and the defenders got inside the walls. It took a 7-month siege to finish it. He never made that mistake again. Over 17 campaigns he pushed Egypt's power to the Euphrates in the north and deep into Nubia in the south, and it held for generations. He is sometimes called the Napoleon of Egypt, which is a little unfair to Thutmose, who did not lose. What that empire meant, at home, was gold. Nubian gold especially, in quantities that made Egypt the richest state in the world and its pharaoh the man every other king wrote to for a loan. We have those letters. In a diplomatic archive found at Amarna there are tablets from the kings of Babylon and Assyria and the Hittites, addressed to the pharaoh as brother, negotiating marriages, and complaining about the quality of the gifts. One of them grumbles, in effect, that the gold he was sent was not as much as promised, and that in Egypt gold is supposed to be as common as dust. It also meant an enormous building program, because a share of everything went to the temples. Karnak, at Thebes, grew over centuries into the largest religious structure ever raised anywhere. Its Great Hall has 134 columns, some of them so thick that it takes several people with joined hands to reach around one, and the whole forest of them was once painted in color and roofed over, so that you walked through it in a kind of permanent stone twilight. And the tribute came in as processions of foreigners carrying things, which the Egyptians painted on the walls of their tombs, with careful attention to the differences in dress and hair and skin, because they were fascinated by the world outside and slightly appalled by it. Egypt at that moment believed, with some justification, that it was the center of the earth, and that the correct order of the universe ran outward from a temple in a river valley, and that the pharaoh's job was to keep it that way. And it is from this age that we get the strangest gift the ancient world has left us. An entire village of ordinary people, whose private letters we can read. To cut the hidden tombs in the Valley of the Kings, the state needed skilled men. Stonecutters, plasterers, draftsmen, painters. And because the work was secret, it could not be done by casual labor walked in from the fields. So the workers were housed together, permanently, in a purpose-built village behind the cliffs, at a place now called Deir el-Medina. They lived there for about 400 years. And because the site is bone dry, and because they wrote constantly on limestone flakes and threw them away, we have thousands upon thousands of their notes. Not official history. The real thing. We have their work rosters, and their reasons for absence, which include a wife giving birth, brewing beer, a scorpion sting, a hangover written down without embarrassment, and, repeatedly, a man being ill. We have a foreman's complaint about a lazy crew. We have laundry lists. We have a father writing about his worthless son. We have love letters, and a woman's furious message about a debt, and a doctor's note. We have a plan of a tomb sketched on a chip of stone, and a draftsman's practice drawings, and on the back of one of them, a beautiful, quick, private sketch of a cat and a dancing girl, done by a man who spent his working life painting solemn gods and clearly wanted, for 10 minutes, to draw something else. We know their names. Kenhekepeshef, who had a library and lent books out. Nonekti, a woman who made a will in which she disinherits the children who did not look after her in old age, and says so plainly. And we have the strike. In the 29th year of Rameses III, the grain rations that paid the workmen stopped coming. They waited. Then they walked off the job, past the guards, and sat down at the mortuary temples, and refused to move. Their foreman pleaded. Officials came and made promises. It happened again, and again. One of them says, "We have come here because of hunger, because of thirst. There is no clothing, there is no fish, there are no vegetables. Send to the Pharaoh our good lord about it, and send to the vizier our superior, that provisions may be made for us." That is the first recorded labor strike in human history, and it reads exactly like a labor strike. And there is one more thing these men are witness to. Toward the end of the new kingdom, with the state weakening and the rations unreliable, the tombs they had built began to be robbed. Sometimes by their own descendants, who knew precisely where everything was. We have the trial records. There are confessions, extracted under beating, in which a stonemason describes breaking into a royal burial, and what they found, and how they divided the gold, and what they did with the coffins. We have the lists of officials who took bribes to look the other way, and the counter-accusations between rival administrators. In the end, the priests gave up defending them. They went through the valley, collected the mummies of the greatest pharaohs of Egypt, rewrapped them, labeled them with docket notes about where they had come from, and hid them together in a shaft in the cliffs, where they lay in a heap in the dark for nearly 3,000 years, until a family of local men found them in the 1870s and started quietly selling the funerary goods. which is how Rameses the Great and Seti and Thutmose all ended up together in one room, wrapped and stacked, waiting. Let that golden valley grow quiet now. Because the next pharaoh in our story is going to try something no one had ever tried, and it will nearly break the country. His name was Amenhotep, the fourth of that name, and he began as an ordinary heir to an extraordinary empire. Egypt at that moment was rich beyond precedent, and its religion was old, and enormous, and expensive. The priesthood of the god Amun at Karnak had grown into something close to a rival government, holding vast estates and vaster influence. And then the new king announced that there was only one god. Not the crowd of familiar faces. Not Osiris in his hall, not Isis, not Amun in his dark sanctuary. One god only, the Aten, the visible disk of the sun itself, shown in the carvings as a circle with long rays reaching down, and each ray ending in a small human hand. He changed his own name to Akhenaten, which means something like he who is effective for the Aten. He closed temples. He had the name of Amun chiseled out of monuments across the country, even where it appeared inside his own father's name. And he left Thebes altogether, and built a brand new capital on an empty stretch of desert, a city we call Amarna, raised from nothing in a handful of years. Something else changed with him, and you can see it instantly. Egyptian art had been formal and idealized for 1,000 years, kings shone forever young and perfect. In Akhenaten's reign it goes strange and soft and almost tender. The royal family are shown with long faces and heavy hips, sitting together, playing with their daughters. In one carving the king and queen are grieving over a dead child, and no Egyptian artist had ever been permitted to show anything like it. His queen was Nefertiti, and her painted bust, found in a sculptor's abandoned workshop at Amarna, is one of the most famous faces in the world. And when he died, all of it collapsed almost immediately. The court left the desert city and went home. The old gods came back. The temples reopened. And within a generation, the people who came after set about erasing him. His name was struck from the king lists. His city was pulled down and its stone reused as rubble inside other buildings. Later Egyptians referred to him, when they had to, as the enemy, or simply that criminal. He was so thoroughly deleted that he was genuinely lost for 3,000 years, and only came back into history when archaeologists began pulling his broken blocks out of the insides of other people's monuments. We do not really know what he was. A visionary, a tyrant, a man in the grip of something. The honest answer is that the evidence supports several stories, and people who have spent their lives on it still disagree. What we can say is this. For about 17 years, one man tried to change what an entire civilization believed, and he had all the power in the world to do it, and the moment he was gone it closed over him like water. Let that empty desert city fall quiet now. Because he left behind a son, a small boy, who inherited the mess. The boy was about 9 years old when they put the crown on him. He had been born at Amarna and named for his father's son Disk. Within a few years the court, or the men running it for him, changed his name to Tutankhamun, for the old god Amun, and moved him back to Thebes. He was the instrument of the restoration, and he was a child. He ruled for about 9 years and died at around 18. We are still not certain why. He had a badly deformed foot and walked with a stick, of which more than 100 were buried with him. He carried malaria. There is a broken leg that may have gone wrong. Any of it, or all of it, might have ended him. He was, by the standards of Egyptian kings, unimportant. He built little. He conquered nothing. His name was left off some of the later king lists along with the rest of his father's family. And that unimportance is exactly why the world knows his name. Because he was buried in a small, hurried tomb, in a corner of the Valley of the Kings, and then the rubble from cutting a later and grander tomb was dumped on top of the entrance. And so, while every other royal tomb in that valley was found and emptied by robbers, his was simply lost. In November of 1922, an archaeologist named Howard Carter, working through the last season his patron was willing to pay for, found a step cut into the rock. They cleared down to a sealed door. Carter made a small hole in the top left corner and put a candle through it, and looked. Behind him, his patron asked whether he could see anything. And Carter said, "Yes, wonderful things." Beyond the door were rooms packed almost to the ceiling. Gilded couches shaped like animals. Chariots taken apart to fit through the passage. Chairs and beds and boxes of linen, jars of perfume, board games, a trumpet, food for the journey. And in the burial chamber, nested one inside another like a puzzle, shrine within shrine and coffin within coffin, a coffin of solid gold, and inside it a young man wearing a mask that has become the face of a whole civilization. Over 5,000 objects. From the tomb of a minor king who died as a teenager. It is the only royal burial from ancient Egypt ever found substantially intact, and standing in front of it you cannot help doing the arithmetic. If this is what they buried with a boy nobody remembered, what was in the tomb of a great king? And then, of course, there is the curse. Lord Carnarvon, who paid for the dig, died a few months after the opening, in Cairo, of blood poisoning from an infected mosquito bite. The newspapers of the world, in the middle of a slow season, did the rest. A curse on the tomb. A warning carved above the door. Death shall come on swift wings. There was no such inscription. And when someone later went through the numbers properly, the people present at the opening lived, on average, about as long as anyone else of their age and class. Howard Carter himself, who was in that chamber more than anybody, lived another 17 years. The curse is not true. But notice how badly we wanted it to be. We opened the door of a boy who had been left alone for 3,000 years, and took everything out, and some part of us felt that such a thing ought to have a price. Let the golden mask go dark now, back into its quiet. The new kingdom still has one more giant in it. If Tutankhamun is the most famous Egyptian, Ramesses II is the one the Egyptians themselves would have named. He ruled for 66 years, which in a world where most people died in their 30s is almost beyond comprehension. He outlived 12 of his own heirs. By the end there were people in Egypt whose grandparents had been born under him, and who had known no other name for the man who held up the sky. And he built. It is not really possible to overstate this. Temples the length of the country, statues of himself in front of every one of them, his name cut so deep into the stone that no successor could ever chisel it out, and cut into other people's monuments too where the mood took him. His greatest is at Abu Simbel, far up the river at the edge of Nubia. for seated figures of himself, each about 20 meters high, carved directly out of a cliff face, with a temple running back into the rock behind them. Twice a year the rising sun reaches all the way down that passage and lights the statues in the innermost chamber. That is not an accident. Early in his reign he fought the great battle of his life at Kadesh, in Syria, against the Hittite Empire. It very nearly went catastrophically wrong. He was drawn forward by false intelligence, his army was strung out, and the Hittite chariots cut his column in half. By his own account he rallied and personally turned the tide, which may even be partly true. The result was, at best, a draw. Both sides went home. And Ramesses came back and covered the walls of Egypt with the greatest victory in history. But something genuinely important came out of it. Some years later, Egypt and the Hittites signed a treaty, and we have it from both sides, in Egyptian on a temple wall and in Akkadian on clay tablets from the Hittite capital. It is the earliest international peace treaty we possess. They agreed to stop, to return each other's fugitives, and to come to each other's aid if attacked. Two empires, more than 3,000 years ago, who had bled each other for a generation, sat down and wrote out how to stop. His mummy survives. He was tall for his time, with a strong hooked nose and hair gone white and dyed with henna. He suffered terribly from his teeth, and from arthritis that would have bent him over in his last years. The god on earth was, at the end, a very old man in a great deal of pain. Let that long reign close. After him, the light begins to go. Nothing dramatic happens next. That is what makes it sad. Egypt does not fall. It slowly stops being the center of things. The empire in Syria slips away. The tomb workers in the Valley of the Kings go on strike, because the grain rations stop arriving, and we have the papyrus record of it, the first documented labor strike in history. Powerful priesthoods and generals carve out their own authority. The country divides again, north and south. And then, for the first time, Egypt is ruled by outsiders, over and over. Kings from Nubia, from the south, come north and take the throne, and they are in many ways devoted Egyptians, reviving old styles and restoring old temples. The kings who came north to take the throne were from Kush, in what is now Sudan, and their story deserves more than a line. Egypt had ruled Nubia for centuries, and had built temples there, and taught its language and its gods to the children of Nubian chiefs. And when Egypt weakened and let go, what was left behind was a Nubian kingdom that considered itself the proper heir to Egyptian civilization, and watched with genuine dismay as Egypt itself fell into squabbling and neglect. So they came to fix it. Their king Pierre marched north around 730 before our era, and his account of the campaign is carved on a granite stele, and it is one of the strangest royal texts in the ancient world. He is furious with the northern rulers, not for opposing him, but for being bad Egyptians. He is scandalized that they are uncircumcised and eat fish, which no proper priest would do. When a city surrendered, he was more interested in going to its temple and making offerings correctly than in looting it. And there is a moment in that inscription where his soldiers capture a rival's stable, and Pierre discovers that the horses have been left hungry during the siege. He is angrier about that than about the war. He says, more or less, that starving his horses is the worst thing this man has done. The Nubian pharaohs, the 25th dynasty, ruled Egypt for about 60 years, and they were in some ways the most devout Egyptians the country had seen in centuries. They restored old temples. They copied old kingdom art, deliberately, reaching back 2,000 years for the correct way to do things. They built pyramids again, back home in Nubia, smaller and much steeper than the ones at Giza, and there are more pyramids in Sudan today than in all of Egypt. What ended them was iron and the Assyrians, who came down from the north with a better army and burned Thebes, an event so shocking it was still being written about in the Hebrew Bible a century later. The Nubian kings withdrew south, back up the river, and kept their kingdom alive at Napata and later Meroe for another 1,000 years, writing in their own script, which we still cannot fully read. So the last people to rule Egypt as Egyptians, in the old style, with the old gods and the old art and a genuine belief in what it all meant, were not from Egypt at all. They came from further up the same river. Then the Assyrians come with iron and burn their way down as far as Thebes. There is a last, lovely revival under a dynasty at Sais, looking back consciously to the old kingdom and copying its art, as if you could get the beginning back by drawing it again. Then the Persians take Egypt. Then, briefly, Egypt throws them off. Then the Persians take it again. And in the autumn of 332 before our era, a young Macedonian arrives with an army, and the Persian governor hands him the country without a fight. Alexander is crowned pharaoh. He goes out into the western desert to the oracle at Siwa and is greeted, they say, as the son of a god. He founds a city on the coast and gives it his own name, and then he leaves, and never comes back. When he dies, his generals divide the world, and one of them, Ptolemy, takes Egypt and keeps it. His descendants rule for nearly 300 years, Greek kings in an Egyptian country, speaking Greek at court, building temples to Egyptian gods in the old style with their own faces on the walls. And before the very end, there was one strange and brilliant flowering, and it happened in a city that was barely Egyptian at all. Alexandria stood on the coast, on the edge of the delta, facing the Mediterranean rather than the desert. Alexander marked out its walls and never saw it built. Under the Ptolemies it became the largest and richest city in the Greek-speaking world, and for a few centuries it was, without much argument, the intellectual capital of the earth. At its harbour mouth stood the Pharaohs, a lighthouse of pale stone rising in 3 tapering stages to something like 100 meters, with a fire burning at the top and a great bronze mirror to throw the light out to sea. Sailors could see it from far over the horizon. It stood for more than 1,000 years, and was finally brought down by earthquakes, and its blocks are still down there in the water of the harbour, where divers photograph them. And attached to the palace was the museum, which means the House of the Muses, and it was something close to the world's first research institute. Scholars were brought in from everywhere, given room and board and a salary, and left alone to work. And with it, the library. The story that it held hundreds of thousands of scrolls may be an exaggeration, but the ambition behind it was real and slightly mad. The Ptolemies wanted a copy of every book in the world. Ships arriving in the harbour were searched, and any scroll found aboard was taken to the library and copied, and, according to one account, the copy was returned to the owner and the original kept. And the work that came out of it is extraordinary. A librarian named Eratosthenes heard that at noon on the summer solstice, in a town far to the south, the sun shone straight down a well and cast no shadow. In Alexandria on the same day, it did cast a shadow. He measured the angle, worked out the distance between the two places, and from those two numbers calculated the circumference of the earth. He got it right to within a few percent. In the 3rd century before our era. With a stick, a well, and geometry. In that same city Euclid set out the geometry that was taught in schools essentially unchanged for 2,000 years. Astronomers argued about whether the Earth went round the Sun, and at least one of them, Aristarchus, said that it did. Physicians dissected human bodies, which almost no one else was permitted to do, and learned things about the nervous system that were then forgotten for a millennium and a half. The library did not burn down in a single dramatic night, whatever you have heard. There was a fire during Caesar's fighting in the harbor that destroyed some of it. But mostly it declined the way institutions actually die. Funding cut. Scholars expelled during a political purge. Attention moving elsewhere. A slow drying up over centuries until there was nothing much left to destroy. That is the sadder truth, and the more useful one. The greatest collection of knowledge in the ancient world was not taken from us by a catastrophe. It was allowed to fade, by people with other priorities, a little at a time. And all of that stood, glittering and Greek, at the mouth of the Nile, while 1,000 miles upriver the old temples went on doing exactly what they had done for 3,000 years, waking the god each morning and putting him to bed at night. 2 worlds, on one river, at the same time. And the older of the two was almost finished. And the last of them is the most famous woman of the ancient world. Cleopatra was not Egyptian by blood. She was Macedonian Greek, the 7th of her name, the end of a long and murderous family line. But she was, apparently, the first of her whole dynasty to actually learn the Egyptian language, and she presented herself deliberately as the living Isis. Her problem was not personal. It was arithmetic. Rome was now vastly stronger than Egypt, and Egypt was rich, and rich weak countries do not stay independent. Everything she did was an attempt to buy time. So she went to the men who held Rome. First Julius Caesar, and by him a son. Then, after Caesar was killed, Mark Antony, and by him twins. Her enemies in Rome told it a seduction, an Eastern queen bewitching good Roman men, and that version has stuck for 2,000 years. Seen from Alexandria, it looks more like foreign policy conducted with the only currency she had. It nearly worked. And then it did not. At Actium the fleet of Antony and Cleopatra was beaten by Octavians, and they fell back to Egypt, and Octavian followed. Antony killed himself. And Cleopatra, rather than be led through Rome in a triumph, killed herself too, at 39. The story says an asp, smuggled in with a basket of figures. It may have been a poison she prepared herself. She was a scholar of such things. And with her, it ends. Egypt becomes a Roman province, a granary, the personal estate of an emperor. 3,000 years, and it closes with a woman in a sealed room, choosing how she would go. Let that last night in Alexandria pass gently now. The story is not quite over. There is one more thing that happens, and it happens much later. For a long time afterwards, Egypt was there and unreadable. The temples still stood, mostly half buried in sand. The pyramids were still on the plateau. Travelers came and stared, and made things up. The last person who could read hieroglyphs died sometime in the 4th or 5th century of our era, and after that the writing on every wall in the country became simply decoration. A voice still speaking, in a room where no one understood the language. For 1400 years, that was the situation. People assumed the symbols were mystical picture writing, each sign a whole idea, and generations wasted themselves trying to read them that way. Then, in 1799, French soldiers digging a fort near a town in the delta pulled a broken slab of dark stone out of an old wall. On it, the same decree was carved 3 times. Once in hieroglyphs, once in a later everyday Egyptian script, and once in Greek, which scholars could read perfectly well. It still took more than 20 years. The breakthrough came from a young Frenchman named Jean-François Champollion, who had taught himself Coptic, the last descendant of the Egyptian language, still used in church services. He realized the signs were not pure symbols at all. Many of them were sounds. It was, in large part, an alphabet in disguise. The story goes that when it finally came together, in September of 1822, he ran to his brother's office, said, "I have got it," and fainted. And then Egypt began to speak. Not just kings and gods. Everything. Tax records and love poems. A schoolboy's practice sheet with the teacher's corrections. A letter from a worker asking for time off because his mother is ill. Notes between neighbors about a borrowed donkey. Names. Thousands and thousands of ordinary names, of people who had been silent for millennia, and whose whole civilization believed that to speak a person's name is to keep them alive. Which means that this old idea of theirs, that as long as your name is spoken you are not entirely gone, turned out to be more literally true than they could have known. They wrote themselves down, in stone and on papyrus. And after a very long silence, we learned to read it. So let us leave them there. Not in a tomb, and not under a curse. Just a people beside a river, who watched the water rise every year, and who thought the world was fundamentally good and orderly, and worth the trouble of keeping. The pyramids are still standing out on the plateau, holding the last of the day's heat. The gods are still painted on the walls of the dark rooms, waiting. And the river, which made every bit of it possible, is still moving north through the night, exactly as it has for all of this, and for far longer. There is nothing left to do tonight. Nowhere further to travel. Only the long slow water, and the dark warm air, and 3,000 years of quiet behind us. Sleep now. The river will still be there in the morning. Rest.